the essence is you need to manage a warm season perennial grass, and you need to make it work for the warmer months and cooler months. So that in fact, it's a relative and subjective thinking, but there is no winter here, right?
Yeah. All right.
So we don't change, and that happens in all the places that I go in that tropical area. It's very similar. You may have be drier or wetter and a little warmer or cooler, but at the end of the day, you just work with these tropical forages and try to make it work. So with that in mind, my research goes towards grazing and conservation.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the two main focus on how to use those tropical forages better that we can get by with the minimum amount of supplementation or extra resources.
All right, today we have Dr. Joao Vendramini from University of Florida. Joe, thank you for jumping on the podcast and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Travis. Glad to be here.
You've done a lot of interesting research, especially on the agronomy side, animal interactions, grazing management, and we'll get into that. But kind of give a background to everyone of, you're from Brazil, University of Florida now, but kind of give a background of how you got where you are today.
Yeah, I think it starts from my background that I came from a family that were in agriculture before. We still have the property and stuff, but I came back from early in the day. We had a beef cattle purebred operation, and then we had commercial cattle operation. So I grew up working with beef cattle and everything that comes with it, right? All the culture and horses and dogs, and I think it's very similar to everything that I have seen here, and a lot of the stakeholders that I related to here in Florida. It seems a very similar growing up and being exposed to beef cattle and everything that comes with it. You grow with, and then it's the time to make a decision, right? To have an education. So when the fun is over and you need to go, I think, to college, and it was natural for me. I didn't have to think much, so I got a degree in agronomy. The institution that I came from, it's all together. Agronomy and animal science is one institution.
Right.
So I focus my training more on the animal science side. But coming from Brazil, it came that it's, and you have experience, you have been in Brazil, and the beef cattle production relies a lot on forages. A lot of times year long forage production or forage management. The beef cattle industry in Brazil is not as robust as it is in the US. So with that in mind, I learned early in life the importance of forage management. That would be the base, and that's what probably was responsible for to be successful or not. It was mainly on the forage management standpoint. With that in mind, so I finished my undergrad, went to a master's degree and in that area, forage management. And at that time, I worked in a private company for 7 years, like a production. Actually, I did my master working at the same time. And that company I worked, I started only working with beef cattle and then expanded to sugarcane, soybeans, corn. And after 7 years, I decided that I would like to change a little the course of my life, and I really liked the research side during my master's. So then I came to the University of Florida to get my PhD, again in forage management. So most of my research and exposure have been this forage animal interaction, many times beef cattle, supplementation. When I finished my PhD, I went to Texas A&M at the research center in Overton. Stayed there for a short time, and then I came back to the position that I'm now here at the University of Florida. That is a research extension position. Primarily also work with forages and beef cattle management.
Well, good. Florida has put out a lot of really good Brazilian scientists. And so there's a long list of you guys coming up from Brazil that have gotten master's PhDs that are doing really good research in the United States and back in Brazil.
Yes, and I think it has been since I came and took a faculty position. I have seen this increase in number of not only Brazilians but more international researchers that come in several areas. But we can deny that because I think the beef cattle production in Brazil is so robust. Now we have Brazilian beef cattle researchers and extension and teaching faculty in several universities in the US, and it seems that became something quite natural transition from Brazil to here and vice versa.
So let's get into some of your research in your areas of beef cattle management and forage management in some subtropical, tropical environments. So what are you doing, and what are you finding with some of your research?
Yeah, it's interesting to work where I work. That is South Florida, right?
Mhm.
It's about 3 hours north of Miami and 3 hours south of Gainesville. Is latitude 29. So where we are at, I mean, I'm sorry, it may be more 27, but where I'm at is quite different from any other environment that we have in the United States or most of the subtropical regions.
Right.
Because when you think about subtropical, you think about winter pasture, right? You think at least some winter annuals, like annual ryegrass, clovers, and many times you have fescue and winter annuals, and that becomes pretty much the base of cow-calf management, right? You can have hay or haylage or silage, but in those regions where they consider that the winter is not as bad as any other temperate locations, you rely on those pastures to make a living in the cow-calf production. Where here in South Florida is very similar to Caribbean, South
Mhm.
America, because we have very little opportunity for winter pastures. And what becomes, it's a tropical warm season perennial for year long,
Mhm.
right? It's just the way that you manage. But the essence is you need to manage a warm season perennial grass, and you need to make it work for the warmer months and cooler months. So that in fact, it's a relative and subjective thinking, but there is no winter here, right?
Yeah. All right.
So
Right.
we don't change, and that happens in all the places that I go in that tropical area. It's very similar. You may have be drier or wetter and a
Mhm.
little warmer or cooler, but at the end of the day, you just work with these tropical forages and try to make it work. So with that in mind, my research goes towards grazing and conservation.
Mhm.
Those are the two main focus on how to use those tropical forages better that we can get by with the minimum amount of supplementation or extra resources.
So back to management of the warm season grasses, and when I think of Florida, a lot of times I think of high rainfall, limited amount of forage, but that's not always the case, and especially where you're located at. And so with your situations, you only have one growing season, right? You don't have the multiple growing seasons of the warm and the cool season forage types. And
Yes, that's correct. It's pretty much one perennial forage that it grows a lot during the growing season and
yep,
quit growing during the other season. But very little tilling or annual forages.
right.
They are not popular. So with that in mind, you're gonna have that season of the year that you're gonna produce a lot, and then you need to manage it to make it through the season where because the many people think about temperature, right?
Hmm.
Many times in the winter, in the other locations, you get too cold, it freeze and everything, so the forage go away. So for us, many times it's not cold, but the length of the day is shorter, and then a lot of these tropical forests, they respond to that, so they quit growing.
Yeah.
Even if it's not, it's green, it's short, and it's not growing.
Mm,
And that is a good thing and a bad thing
right.
because it creates that expectation on the producers that they don't need to do anything, right?
Hmm.
And then I think year after year, we have better and worth winters, but there's always a limitation of forage. I think
Hmm.
that is the main constraint that we try to address in the research program.
So how are you addressing those issues of high growth and then no growth, and just have this this, I don't know if you call it dormant forage because it's still green, but it's in this state of not being reproductive or growing.
Mhm. Yeah, and that I think it comes with different programs. Sometimes in academia, as you know, we need to report those. So we try to make a summary of each little effort, right?
Right.
And someone that is not probably related to cattle and forage can understand what we are doing and further evaluate what we do, right?
Right. Right.
So I think one of these little efforts that I have is identifying forage species. So it's selection slash breeding
Mm-hmm.
and management all together. So I work with breeders, like true forage breeders, and I bring a lot of material from other locations to try to see how can we extend the growing season
Mm-hmm.
on those forages. So even when the days are shorter and it's not that cold, we can still have some fall grazing or early spring grazing.
Right.
That makes a huge difference. It may be a month. So we release a Bermuda grass cultivar called Miss Levy in 2021 or two. So where the main focus was, it doesn't produce more than the other Bermuda grass during the growing season, but it does early in the spring, later in the fall.
Yeah.
So those are the efforts that we try to keep in the selection and breeding. Not only selecting those like this Bermuda grass that we release, but also to introduce some that are not very popular in the area,
Mm-hmm.
and then trying to compare those with the standard that we have to see how they may work out and cover some gaps that we have.
So are these varieties a little more um, dry tolerant, or are they just more or less sensitive of that declining sunlight?
There are, I think, different factors. For example, I brought a cultivar here called Camelo, like a camel,
Mm-hmm.
that was released by the CIAT in Colombia for the Center of Tropical Agriculture. And the appeal for the cultivar is really drought tolerant. That was the appeal from the information from the release variety.
Mm-hmm.
So we brought to here, we felt that it doesn't respond any differently from other cultivars that we have, for example, Bermuda grass, in a drought situation. But we found that it's planted by seed. That is something very beneficial for us because it's practical. A lot of the forages that we have, we need to plant by vegetative material, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a lot of work. And this Camelo has outstanding nutritive value and is cold tolerant.
Mm.
Something that in Colombia they never evaluate that because they don't have cold weather, right?
Right.
So then I bring it here and I put at higher latitudes, like on the border with Georgia, and I have some tropical forages dying, and that Camelo is just thriving, come back in the spring really nicely, and has a very good nutritive value. So those are just some examples of the things that we try to accomplish and try to fit some characteristics in these gaps, and that's great for us. This kind of forage, some of the tropical forage, they don't have dormancy, right?
Mm. Right.
You can trigger them really easily by one day of warm weather, they wake up,
Mm-hmm.
and that is not very good because then you get a frost, and if you do that 2 or 3 times, you kill the forage,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So then we try to access how tolerant you'll be under those conditions, so then we can claim that that's a perennial forage even in a little colder weather. But it's just fascinating because we see that we get a lot of material with limited information, and
Mm-hmm.
then, like the Camelo, like the Panicum that we are testing right now, it just comes so many new informations, and you learn so much about the plant that it's very exciting.
It's really interesting that it was cold tolerant, and coming from a place that it's never been exposed to it. And you think about plants, animals adapting to their environments, and And there's other species that we know within species, if they was raised in, grew up in the Alps or some higher elevation, it's a totally different growth pattern than the same species that was grazed down in or that was grown down in a valley. And so it's really interesting that it was cold tolerant coming from that environment.
Yeah, and we need to have that in a context, right? It's cold tolerant for North Florida.
Correct. It's not cold tolerant for northern U.S.
Yeah, exactly. It's cold tolerant in that window where we have limitations, right? We have like 10 freezing events a year.
Right.
And most of the true tropical forest, they can survive. But this one, it bounced back. And when we have other entries, there were genotypes at the time that they pretty much disappeared. And so I think those are the little examples, that the things that we work. And moving to the second area is pretty much combining this. So we have a forage that will grow more in the spring and fall, but also we incorporate, mainly by necessity, a section in the program that is pretty much about conserving forage. It may be stockpiling, it may be haylage, silage, or hay. Right. So then we try to adapt those species and cultivars to a situation where we can preserve it better if it's eventually needed.
So is that a challenge that, since you have high growth rates, that people tend to want to stock to the high growth rate? And by the time you get to your drier seasons or lack of growth, they're out of forage. And because of this idea of I'm stocking to meet that demand early on and not saving anything for the rest of the year.
Yes, absolutely. I think that is and if I have to give an advice, free, right, for the producers, beef cattle producers here, and solve many problems that we have, I just close my eyes and tell them to call 20% of the herd. Mm-hmm. So then, if they call 20% of the herd that's not productive anyway, so they will have 80% that will be very productive, and most of the problems will be solved. Right. But it's very difficult for I understand, as coming from a producer background, I understand. People love animals, they don't love forage. Nobody likes forage, they don't care, and they need to have forage, but they love the animals. And with that in mind, it's really difficult to make those decisions because we create the mindset that more is better, right? We have more cows, more calves, we have more money, and that is exactly start playing against you in all aspects, right? Production, economics, so on and so forth. But I think that is the challenge, to allocate that stock of forage that you have to some time where you are limited, right? And make those to work. We keeping your body condition score in place, your nutrition in place, and also your pasture alive. Yep. And there is this expectation here that may not be maybe different in different areas, that the pasture is perennial. Mm-hmm. They will plant once and they will carry them to their lifetime, right? If it dies, it's a horrible thing, and it is, because it's expensive to do it. Yep. But that decision is a producer decision, because if they keep overgrazing, they keep the cows on top all the time, what happens? Something that is perennial will die. They ended up with weeds. They'll have to replant, right? Right. And we have seen the scenario many times, but it's just a continuation of probably education and data that we generate to try to, to have that point made that there is a balance there that we need to meet.
It's sometimes hard because they see some short-term benefits of more cows, but ranching and farming is a long-term game, and degradation of their farmland, ranch land by overgrazing will have big negative impacts down the road, and those are hard to fix, and they're costly to fix.
And I think there is I think we still have a very positive scenario, because we have about a lot of rangeland here in Florida, although it's not well promoted. I think people don't know. They think when you talk about rangeland, they think about the West, right?
Correct.
That's rangeland. But we still have, and we have half of our research center is research on rangeland.
Yep.
natural rain. And there is a very important decision to make on those, because if you make a mistake, right, it's almost impossible to fix it.
Yeah. Right.
Right? You
Right.
don't seed, you don't fertilize, you don't replant, you don't do anything.
Right.
So in that scenario, you need to be conservative, and that's not
Right.
the case. We know that, and that hasn't been the case historically. So
Right.
I think now we are trying to improve a little. When on the planted pasture, I think the people make the mistake and they pay for it. They can't fix it,
Yes, they can.
right?
Yep.
But they will pay for it, and it's very costly. And I think those are two different scenarios when we talk about little natural rangelands and unimproved land. I think that is, I am trying to bring the message that there you really need to be conservative. There is no room
Right.
to make a mistake, because there's no way back.
No, and those mistakes don't have to be big mistakes. They can be small mistakes year in, year out that slowly make that impact. And 20 years down the road, you'll finally see the negative impact of what you started doing 20 years ago.
Yes, that is very true. Yeah, and then start hurting your production, right? You
Correct.
start, if you don't really measure, because we measure as a researcher, but a lot of the producers, like you said, they start harvesting those problems over time. When
Right.
they get to a point that they see, well, the same place where I have one cow in 20 acres, now I need 40.
Yep.
And then the cow is losing body condition, the performance is not the same that was a few years, and that's too late, right?
I can't count the number of calls that I've had of, I used to be able to do this, and today I have these problems.
Mhm.
And it's because of what they did, 5-10 years down earlier, causing issues today. And so, that's every decision has a downstream effect, and sometimes those are hard to see up front.
Yeah, that's true.
So let's switch gears a little bit here and talk about some of your supplementation research. How are you overcoming some of these issues with your forage in that winter time point that it's not growing? There are some limitations there.
Yeah, the supplementation work, and I think, on the research and extension, on the research standpoint, we try to increase efficiency, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not production. And I think this is the name of the game, because every single person that is in beef cattle production, they know that if you feed more, it will be better, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that is not a new concept. So if you want to solve the problem, you go to the feed store and buy a bag of feed, and you don't need to be very technical, right? Even you can buy something and then try to, you're gonna get better results. But the thing is, that's not profitable, right? We
Right.
know that they will eat the whole economic feasibility of your enterprise, and then it's not fun anymore, right? Then they are losing money, and then becomes a pain. So with that in mind, we have these forages here, and that if you do stockpiling, or even if you do hay, in general, although the warm season forages, they have a bad reputation because of bad management, right?
Uh-huh.
We know that we will have forage with a nutritive value that will be very difficult. You're going to have any preservation process that will meet all the requirements, right? And very difficult.
Yep.
With that in mind, I think we have been trying a lot of different sorts and combination, such as a lot of people have done in the country, right? What would be the best source of rumen degradable or undegradable, or combination for different categories? We know that work with mature cows, we will have a completely different approach than working with growing heifers.
Yep.
And we have a environmental limitation here, because we win in July, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it's hot and humid. We actually win in July. A lot of the people, I'm just generalizing here, to get these animals out of Florida before we have a hurricane or two, right?
Yeah.
So that's the goal. But if you keep those heifers here, we know that even when you feed 1%, 1.5% of the body weight, in the best pasture that you have, you're going to have 1.5 pounds
Mm-hmm.
performance. So it's very inefficient, right? The conversion and all the supplementation that we have, and the genetic is, and we have a little more Bos Indicus influencing the cattle,
Right.
but that promote growth because of the heterosis. So if you send those heifers to Mississippi or to better place, they will do
Yeah.
2.5 pounds. And
Right.
then here will be a pound and a half that will be pretty much limited by the environmental conditions that we have.
Right.
So with that in mind, I think we have been trying to fit what is the most efficient thing that we can do considering these limitations that we have, right? That is the association of forage with low nutritive value and then the environmental limitation. This is mainly for growing animals because when you go to the mature cows, I think it's not easy, but it's much easier to keep a cow with a body condition score that will be acceptable. And I have worked with Felipe Moriel here that he does much more work on the physiology standpoint and fetal programming, and not only the benefit that we have in the body condition score and subsequent pregnancy, but also all the benefits that happen for the offspring, when it's born, the better plane of nutrition, doing different approaches, quantities, and composition through the time. We did work like everybody did with some additives as well, because there has been one appeal to try to decrease the quantity and try to save some money in different aspects of supplementation. And I think that has been mainly the focus on the supplementation program, is try to survive in the hot weather with the growing animals, just heifers, and try to keep those cows in body condition score 5 in good condition during the fall. That will be our breeding season, right? Fall, early winter.
Yep.
And then get this calf that will be as productive as we can be, I think.
What is one of your biggest recommendations to producers? If there's one thing you want producers to know, what would that be?
Yeah, I think it will be on this general management standpoint. I tell them to have different, put the eggs in different baskets, right?
Yeah.
So one of them for us here is they need to have 10, 15%, up to 20% of stockpiled pasture, right? That will go well for the mature cows. That will be, and then it depends on the size of operation. You may need to have some hay or haylage that will be very important for the growing animals, because those you can control and have those allocated with numbers, right? So you have that amount, and then you need to feed that amount of animals.
Right.
Without being loosely or just based on experience. And then if you have a plan in place, right? If you have a forage budget, if it doesn't go well and by March you are short, at least you have a good control of what you have, and you can make improvements to next year, because it is fixable. This year, a lot of producers end up with no hay because we didn't have a good growing season in the fall. And then you need to buy cubes, right? Or buy dry feed. You can fix that problem, but that may be a wake-up call for next year. The bad year will come.
Correct.
And I think that is the message, to try to have different assets that you can invest in that winter, right? During the summer, I think it's much easier to navigate through. So we rarely get calls or questions. In the summer, it seems that everybody's happy.
Flexibility is a key to the game, and losing flexibility is killer.
Absolutely.
It's time for our famous 3. Virbac, committed to growth. As fellow cattle professionals and veterinarians working with herds around the world for over 50 years, we know the challenges you face in the unpredictable world of caring for cattle. That's the Virbac difference. Whatever your herd size may be, we offer a new approach to cattle health, one driven by passion, knowledge, and genuine understanding of your needs. Our products are backed by on-farm research to ensure they help you thrive in the real world. In everything we do, we are dedicated to supporting you and the well-being of your cattle for generations to come. For more information, visit vet-us.virbac.com/cattle or see your Virbac representative.
All right, Joe, to wrap us up, I've got a few questions here. One is, what is your go-to beef-related resource or resources?
I think I like to mix the scientific information with the popular press,
Okay.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we rely on both and have a better feeling of the industry and what's going on, what is being advertised. So we go to drovers, for example,
Yeah.
and progress farmers and progress dairy. I try to cover most of those popular resources too. And I also learn about what my colleagues are doing in those, right?
Right. Right.
I really enjoy reading those. And also when we try to advise and get management practice, so then we rely pretty much on scientific publications, right, on
Mhm.
data, and try to digest and make something that will be useful,
Yep.
right, for producers. And that is the same outlet that we all in science use, like applied animal science,
Right.
translational animal science, journal of animal science. And I think based on the resources, we got to a point now that is very dangerous, because Google is a great thing to move us through life and made our jobs much more important
Right.
than it was before. I think people say, why people will call you if they can access Google? I really love that, because please, if you want to get information from Google, please do, and
Mhm.
you're going to see the outcome,
Right.
right?
Right.
And then you may decide to call me, right?
Right.
Because I think that will be a disaster. So with that in mind, we are able to select those publications that are scientific publications that have reasonable data
Mhm.
from the general public that just open Google and say, well, I think if we apply this liquid lime, I think that will solve our problem. And then, few things happen, and they ended up calling us.
No, that's a very good point. So, what is a go-to book that you recommend people reading or utilizing that's non-ag?
Right. Yeah. Here in Florida, we have a classic here that's called The Land to Remember.
Mm-hmm.
That is about the history of Florida since
Yeah.
the Civil War. And that is an excellent book. You go through that. And if you work with agriculture, it's even, I think, better for you to read. But also, you talk about the development of these big cities like Miami.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a very interesting book.
Well, good. We'll have to look that one up. So, lastly, what sets apart someone that's very successful as a beef professional?
Yeah, I think that is probably what everybody wants, right? To be successful and to have the answer. And I think I didn't get there, so it may be it may be what I'm aspiring to find one time. But it seems that the core values and character is probably the most important thing that you can have in any field, right?
Right.
If you are playing football, or if you are in the beef cattle professional, or if you are a plumber, right?
Yeah. Right.
It doesn't matter. Is I think the world is changing quite rapidly,
Mm-hmm.
and I think some of the core values may be lost because we have a lot of resources on communication that allow us to be a little looser in different areas. But I don't think anything will ever. You can go through artificial intelligence and everybody else that will help us through this process, but there will never, I think, substitute work ethics and
Yeah.
come back and work and wake up early in the morning and be respectful and be honest, and those things. I think it can take you long ways through any career or anything that you do in life.
I totally agree. But one thing I will disagree is that you are successful.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Yeah, thank you.
You've had a really good career, and so you've done a lot of good stuff for Florida producers in the United States and elsewhere. And so I wouldn't discredit that as you haven't achieved it, because you've done a lot.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Joe, thanks for jumping on the podcast. Really appreciate your time and enjoyed talking about problems and challenges that producers down in Florida, Southern Florida have.
Yeah, thank you, Travis. Thanks for having me. It was really a pleasure to be here.